Hey everybody, and welcome back to Radical Slice. My name is Eric. This is my journey on which you are a hopefully willing participant as I try to create something that looks a little bit like the old Kung Fu game on the NES. In this episode, we're going to add a little bit more visual flair. So we're going to add some little comic book style impact sprites. We're going to add some little bit of visual indication of the hug of death. And finally, we're gonna smash some baddies into little pieces and send them flying a little ways across the screen. So let's just dive right in. Another small graphical tweak that I think would be nice to have is what I've been referring to in my head as an impact sprite. Now I'll probably throw some footage of Kung Fu up on the screen at this point, but when you punch or kick a guy in Kung Fu, you get this cool little white explosion thing, even though it's not, nothing is exploding, but like a thwack, sort of, yeah, an impact bubble. So I thought drawing something like that and displaying it to the screen would be kind of interesting. There will probably be some implementation changes needed for that though, because there's nothing managing those sprites right now. Probably like main would have to do it if I was going to do it right now, like the main game loop. There's like a baddie manager, but there's no like explosion sprite manager. So let me draw the sprite first, and then I'll figure out how to manage it in code. Give me a minute here. I think something like these will work. I just drew, this one's a little bit lighter, as in it's more ethereal. It uses fewer pixels than the Kung Fu one. And then I just kind of flipped it horizontally to make two of them. So I think what I'll do is just to give it a little bit of visual variety, I'll just randomly select one every time there's an impact and use that particular sprite. Let me plug this in and kind of see how it looks. I'm thinking for right now, I'm going to manage this just kind of in global scope. So I created this table called effects, and that table has a thing called impacts. I did this because I could see maybe adding some other sort of similar types of objects that we might want to manage later, like particles and stuff like that. So rather than just having the impact sprites right in FX, we'll do FX impacts and FX particles and FX whatever else. Anyway, so yeah, so I initialize this to be empty, and then I have this impact sprites table, which has the sprite indices for the two little sprites I just drew in the upper left there. Then what I noticed was that from combat collision with the baddie manager, I wasn't returning any values, right? So there was no way for me to know if there actually was a collision outside of this function. So if we have a look at that, what this was doing is just checking for collision between the player's fists and feet and the baddies. And if there was a collision, it would play a sound effect and it would remove that baddie or that projectile from the baddie manager table. But we actually, if we're going to manage those impact sprites in main, we need to know what happened in this combat collision function, right? Main needs to like ask the baddie manager, like, yo, did you do anything? If you did, I would like to know about it. So yeah, so I set up this impact variable here and I initialize it to false. So I assume that there's not any impact, nothing happened. Then if there was either a combat collision with one of the baddies or with one of the projectiles, I set impact to true and I return that. One thing which may cause a bug or maybe a problem is that since I'm checking for the baddies and the projectiles in the same function, if there's an impact with two of those things in the same frame, there might only be one impact sprite, but that feels like not a huge deal right now. Maybe I'm okay with that for right now. Same thing, I guess, if there was like an impact with two baddies, we would only display one sprite. But again, maybe that's not the end of the world. So anyway, this is how I'm letting the baddie manager tell main that there was some sort of collision. And at that point, if there was any impact, main is going to add just an X and a Y coordinate and an impact sprite chosen at random from those two to this fx.impacts table. And then what I'm going to do is, oh, and also I'm setting a TTL. You can see kind of at the end here. So in order to make this easy to see at first, I set the TTL to a full second. Obviously, we won't probably need to keep it there for a full second. That'd be weird. But what I'll do is every game loop, I'll just loop through this impacts table, display the sprite if it's still there, and deduct whatever amount of time has passed from the TTL. Let me do that next. Let me just mention what I'm doing right here. So they're showing up okay. They display just fine, but I'm not super stoked with the position. And I think that's because like I'm using the player's hand and fist position to set where the impact is, which I thought that would be okay, but it feels not quite right. It feels like too close to where, too close to the player, not close enough to the baddie, if that makes sense. Like I want it to be further out. I might be able to offset it a little bit, but then I feel like on this side, yeah, like on the right hand side, it makes more sense. Maybe I can offset it by a few pixels and see how I like that. Hold on a sec. Okay, what I decided to try, I don't know if this is gonna work, but rather than returning just like a Boolean flag from the baddie manager's combat check to say like, yeah, there was a collision, I'm gonna return the baddie's position. All right, so, and then try to use that as the location of the impact sprite. And what I'm doing in order to indicate that there was a collision is I'm gonna set the default values to -1 and -1. Presumably like that will never happen because that would be like way the heck up in the upper right hand corner. Like there would be no collisions up there, hopefully. And then like to make it even a little bit more interesting, I'm actually going to not just return the baddie's X and Y coordinates, but I'm going to offset them by a few random pixels. What I'm doing here is getting a random value from, oh, I want this in a different place. I'm getting a random value from 0 to 6, flooring it, and then subtracting 3. Actually, this should be 7, shouldn't it? This should give us a value between like -3 and +3. When I say this, I mean this part here. This should give us a random value between -3 and +3. And that'll kind of just randomly offset the position of where the collision happened by a few pixels, so that the little impact sprites won't like pile up on one another, and it'll be like a little bit more sort of arbitrary looking. So then in here, let's see where that impact was. Rather than, yeah, okay, so what we'll do is we'll set local pos X, pos Y. We'll set those to -1 and -1 as well. And then, actually, we just do this. So we should be getting some values back from combat collision here. If those are -1, then we know that not to do anything. But if they are not -1, then something should happen. So let's see. We can just do one check here and cheat. Pos X is not equal to -1, then we know something happened, and we'll set the X and Y positions here. Maybe that'll work. Let me see. It didn't error. That's good. Okay, those are way higher than I want them to be. It's okay, but it's like kind of randomy. That's good. They're like super high up though. That looks a little funky. All right, scratch everything that I said last time. I went back to just returning a Boolean here for the impact. from the baddie manager rather than like the baddies X and Y. That was just getting too complicated. He said before then adding a whole bunch of randomness to this part. Yeah, so what I ended up doing was going back to using the player's fists and feet, the player's limbs location, as the base position for the explosion. And I am offsetting it a little bit based on whether the player's facing left or right. So I'm kind of like looking at the leftmost edge of the player's fist if they're facing the left, and the rightmost edge if they're facing to the right. That's why you can see I'm using PX0 here, which is the left edge, and PX1 here, which is the right edge. And then finally, when I add the impact sprite, I did leave in just a little bit of randomness, like 1 pixel in each direction in both X and Y, to allow for, I don't know, a little bit of excitement. Just one pixel of excitement. So you can see, and I also reduced the TTL to 0.2 of a second. So it kind of looks like this. So that's not bad looking. It'll be cooler once we add like some sort of, falling animation or death animation for the baddies too. But overall, that's not too bad. Those guys just owned me. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it'll be cooler once we add some extra visuals for the baddies, but at least we have something in there now. I wanted to add a little bit more of a visual cue from the players being hugged. And originally I had sort of like thought to add some sprites where he's like kind of panicking and like flying back and forth. That presented some difficulties though, because I allowed the player to like crouch and turn around and stuff, and so I was gonna have to have like different sprites for the crouching and the standing state, and I don't know, it just felt weird. And I was like, maybe this is why Kung Fu didn't bother to do something like this. So what I did was I just opted to print some exclamation marks above the player's head when they're being hugged, so it gives the player like some indication like something is amiss here. And the way I did it was I'm doing 3 different print statements because I wanted the exclamation marks to be printed like really close to each other. And if you just print them out in the same print statement, they like the spacing between the letters is too broad. So I'm sort of manually positioning the X position, the X coordinate. And then for Y, I'm adding a bit of randomness, which is what makes them jiggle. Nope, I just died. So like by having 3 different calls to rand, each of the exclamation marks kind of moves up and down in its own way. It marches to the beat of its own drummer, and so that kind of gives it like a little bit of like funky excitingness that I quite like. Similar to how when the player runs out of health, they kind of like get kicked off the screen like that. Currently, when we punch the baddies, they just kind of disappear. There's the impact sprite, which is nice, but they just kind of like they go away, and I want to either have them fall off the screen kind of like the player does and like they do in Kung Fu, or maybe break them into pieces and have the pieces fall off the screen or land on the ground. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, but I think the first step is to maybe play with the sprite editor and see if I can come up with any like sort of visual ideas that trigger my imagination, for lack of a better word. So let me play around with sprites for a bit. All right, I had to fix a whole bunch of bugs there, but I'm pretty happy with where this is. So notice that when I punch these dudes, they're going to turn into little dude pieces. Observe, and they sort of fall off the screen. Um, yeah, this is basically what I wanted. So let me show you sort of conceptually how I put this together, and then we'll go through the code a little bit. All right, so as we've sort of talked about before, but we haven't mentioned in a while, there is this sort of called a top level object that we've been referring to as the baddie manager, or BMGR, so that I don't have to write the whole thing out every time. And then this guy sort of handles the updating and drawing of all the baddie related pieces. So like the trees, the boss, the when the boss throws projectiles, that sort of stuff. And so up until now, it's kind of had these members. So it's been handling the trees and the boss and the apples that the boss throws. And for this one, I added a new part called that I refer to as the bits, which is when the trees explode, they turn into little bits. So the reason I initially was gonna like have the bits managed in sort of the main game loop, but I opted against that because what happens is when we create bits, what happens is like to give you like an idea for like the logic before we have a look, like the batting manager will sort of, let's call it manager. Manager detects collision. And then the tree, we'll use trees for now. So the tree's gonna die. And then this has like some like X and Y information that needs to be recorded, right? So we want the bits to not just show up kind of arbitrarily on the screen. They need to show up where the tree gets hit, right? Where the impact happens. So my options were either from the collision detection function to like return this data to main and have main do it, or to just kind of encapsulate everything in the batting manager, which is just like a lot easier to have the, because the manager already knows where the dead tree is and kind of knows everything about, it knows everything that it needs to know to create the bits. So that's where I put the logic. So now we've just added like make some bits. So this is just gonna create, it's gonna look at the type of the baddie, in this case it was a tree, and then create a whole bunch of bits and then add to bits table, add those bits to the table. So then what happens is whenever we call the baddie manager's update function from main, it's going to do update trees, and then update the boss, and update the apples, and finally it's going to update the bits, like that. So let's have a look at some code. Actually, before we look at the code, let me just show you. I kind of took the tree sprite, this guy, and broke it into little tiny pieces. So you can see on the left here, we've got a mouth and an eye, and then a couple of pieces of the head, and then this thing which is supposed to be like a root. I could have done this with like particles, right? And just had like used like some sort of particle library, which I've used in the past. But I wanted to try it with sprites. I guess what I was nervous about is whether or not this would stress Pico-8 if I like just was creating a whole bunch of sprites on screen. It doesn't seem to be though. It seems to be rendering it without much trouble. So anyway, I took these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bits, and I declared them up at the top of the baddie file here. So tree bits. So again, this is only for trees so far. I'll have to add like separate sprites and bits for the other enemy types. But in any case, we've got the tree bits here. And what happens is whenever there's a collision, we check the type of the baddie. And I actually had to add this. So baddies didn't have like this type variable contained in them. So it was, at a certain point, you couldn't tell what type of baddie it was. The baddie manager was kind of agnostic to that. So I added that in so that if it's a tree, we're going to look at that table of sprites, that tree bits, and just add a bunch of bits to it. And I'm randomizing these two values are the x and y velocity, the initial x and y velocity. And so I'm adding some randomness to it so that they don't just all kind of stack on top of each other. That's why when you see the bits spawn, they kind of all have different locations on the screen. They sort of spread out a little bit and they fall at slightly different, not at different rates, but from different starting x positions. So if we have a look here, There should be no surprises in this part of the code because it's very similar to what we were doing for spawning regular baddies. One thing is I did copy the logic from the code that we wrote for the player when the player gets knocked off the screen. So I'm sort of gradually throttling the X velocity by multiplying it by 0.8 every time update is called. And also I'm making sure that the Y velocity doesn't get totally out of control. One thing that's a little bit different here is that I added a TTL. So rather than just tracking the location of the baddie sprites on the screen and kind of checking when they fall off the screen, I'm setting a time to like remove them from the baddie manager's bits array. So after they've been on screen for a second currently, I'll remove them, which seems to give them plenty of time to get off the screen. I think one of the reasons I added this is because I thought it might be worthwhile to just not have them fall completely off, to just sort of like fall briefly and then disappear. The other thing that's a little bit different from the regular baddies is you may have noticed like that the sprites flash when they turn to bits. Right, so I'm not drawing them every frame. I'm using similar logic to the player's invincibility logic. I'm just checking like the current time. I'm calling it DT, but it's actually the current time. And if modding it by 2 leaves some sort of remainder, then they flash. So this basically like draws it on and off to give it that sort of more ethereal quality. I thought this would be like less distracting because you don't really want to hit the bits after you've already killed the tree. It's just sort of an effect. So I didn't want the bits to like how can I say this, like draw over the other baddies that can actually hurt you, and that's why I gave them that sort of flashing effect. All right, that things are getting long enough as it is, so I think we're gonna wrap things up here and continue the bits next time. But thank you again for all the time that you're investing in watching these videos. It is like it does not go unnoticed. This will be noted in your evaluations. Thank you all for hanging out. Yeah, and if you enjoyed this, click that thumbs up or something, or whatever. Just like say hi in the comments. I read them all because there's only like a couple every week. So in any case, take care, y'all, and I will talk to y'all next week.